We've spent the bulk of the morning talking about the science of alternative matrices. And if you're like me and not a scientist, you're waiting for the policy implications. How do we implement this? How do the leagues implement this? And so we put together this panel on policy applications of alternative matrices. And to moderate that panel, I now have the privilege of introducing Mr. Michael Ask, the CEO of Anti-Doping Denmark. Michael joined the anti-doping community in 2015 after a 30-year-long employment in the Danish police, ending his career as Detective Chief Superintendent and Head of Department, Mr. Michael Ask.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a pleasure for me to be asked to moderate this panel discussion. I must admit, when I was asked initially by Michael, I thought, well, like Michael, I'm not a scientist myself, so I was a little anxious about this topic. But on the other hand, I have, as Michael mentioned, a long career in law enforcement, and one thing you learn in law enforcement is to ask questions, even the naive or the stupid ones. So in that perspective, I should be the perfect one maybe for trying to moderate this session. I'll do my best. So we already heard some very interesting speakers talking about some of the benefits for new ways of making drug testing. Like for instance the less invasive sampling methods that we don't have necessarily always to bother the athletes waiting for them to be able to pee in a cup. We also learned that there would be simplified ways of shipping and storing the samples in some of these methods, and maybe we could even reduce the costs, which is obviously a subject important for all of us. We also learned already that there are some challenges, of course, like always when you invent new methods. Security, it is not methods that are necessarily validated thoroughly enough yet. They're certainly not accredited yet. And there are risks of tampering with these samples, as there of course also are with the well-known way of testing. And there's a lot of other issues we need to take into consideration before we decide whether we would like to use, or we decide to use some of these methods. I think also, seen from a more general perspective, human nature is very often, in a way, we as human beings, we like new innovations in a way because it makes life easier for us in certain ways. But I think also a lot of us have a tendency to be a little bit reluctant to accept new methods, because it also creates some problems for us sometimes in our organizations. We need to invent new structures, new methods. We maybe even have to change our rules, our legislation, and it gives us a lot of extra work to conduct before we eventually, maybe down the road, will reap the benefits of these new inventions. So I think in this session we will try to discuss whether we are ready or not in the anti-doping community as such to embrace some of these new developments. And I think I have a very distinguished and experienced panel here, and I will introduce them shortly before we start the question session, the Q&A session. To the left, seen from where you are sitting, we have Dan Halem, who is the Chief Legal Officer at here in this Major League Baseball here in this building, have their offices here. And next to him, we have Andy Levinson, who is the Vice President of the Professional Golfers Association, PGATOUR, and he is, amongst other things, responsible for anti-doping policies. And last but not least, we have Jeff Novitzky, who is the Vice President of the Athletes' Health and Performance at the Ultimate Fighting Championship. So I don't think we could have assembled a much more experienced panel with some from very big sports organizations, some major sports organizations. So it'll be interesting for you to to have your takes on some of these questions. So, who should be the first one? Dan, since you're sitting next to me almost. Just for a starter, what are your thoughts generally about these new methods you have heard about this morning? What are what do you see do you see some of them as something you could use in your organization, and what kind of benefits do you see?
Well, good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to Major League Baseball. I guess before I start, I should do kind of a little infomercial here. And we can't really talk about all these new methods without first talking about research. And, given, our involvement throughout the years in the anti-doping community, I've personally come to realize that, research and funding research is key. It's not the type of industry where, private industry, such as drug manufacturers, are going to fund the research. It really comes from, public sources, WADA, which is financed in large part, by government entities, and, the group sponsoring, this conference that we're part of, the PCC, funds research. So, the one, I think, thought I'll leave you with is that, before you can even have a conversation about kind of any of the things that, were discussed this morning, there has to be, funding available for it. Each of your organizations, hopefully is kind of playing your part. But, to the extent you're interested in joining the PCC and helping us, you should see me or see any of the members, during this conference, because, research is key to kind of staying ahead of the curve. In terms of, looking at new ways to essentially collect samples, we at baseball, after the agreement we just made with the Players Association, Bob Lenahan from the Players Association is sitting to my left. Between the major and minor leagues, this year in 2017, we'll collect a total of 25,000 samples between blood and urine, which is a lot of samples. Probably the most we've ever done. In terms of the collection chain, everybody part of that chain, I think at the major league and minor league level, is like sitting in this room right now, interestingly enough. Both of our collection agencies, CDT and Drug Free Sports, Montreal Lab, Dr. Ayotte, who handles all our collections at the major league level, Daniel Eichner, who handles our collections from the Smyrtle Laboratory for our minor league program. So people kind of involved in the program, realize that, collecting urine samples, while it's the best we have at the moment, it does have its challenges. For a sport in which we're collecting every day, both, before and after games, people in this room have experience, waiting for players to provide a sample, dilute samples, partial samples, the whole 9 yards. John Coyles in the back of the room that, runs our drug programs, and Bob Lenahan, constantly receiving calls, in the middle of the night about issues. And when you're collecting, at least in terms of urine, 20,000 samples, it has its challenges. It has its challenges, for the laboratories in terms of, getting these, urine samples intact, storing them. So, any way to, sort of expedite that process, relieve some of the burden on the athlete, is certainly a good thing. But, that being said, just in terms of, the way, the industry has progressed, I mean, the laboratories, the collection agencies are pretty good, with urine these days. I mean, they, we've kind of evolved to the point where we have, extreme confidence in the testing that's done on urine samples. I think, we're probably getting there too with HGH and blood samples, although kind of worldwide we haven't seen, enough positives really to, at this point, to, kind of make a lot of judgments. So the key in terms of alternative testing methods, obviously, is to get to a point where, the scientists are comfortable enough, with it and are able to conduct tests for, the endless litany of banned substances that we now test for, in order to make it useful. And also, from an athlete's perspective and from the Players Association's perspective, to give them confidence to buy into it. And, that's going to take research. Certainly from our experience with, biomarker testing for HGH, peer-reviewed research, open research is probably the way to go, for transparency purposes. If you're going to get, sort of buy-in from, in the amateur level, the athlete community, and the professional level from the athlete / Players Association. But, given, the benefits, which I view, reducing the burden on the athlete, reducing the cost for entities that, aren't as blessed as Major League Baseball and the NFL and the other professional sports where, frankly, we can't afford to do 25,000 tests. Like a little aside, when I spoke last year in London at a conference before doping organization throughout the world, and I told them the type of resources that, we had at baseball to combat doping. I mean, their heads were spinning. It's all about resources. We understand that now. It's all about how much you can test. It's all about, having the best labs. It's all about funding research. And, what you're kind of seeing now, at least my opinion, and others are more experts on it. I mean, the, kind of anti-doping community throughout the world, the different federations, the different anti-doping, agencies, a lot of times just don't have the resources to do this the right way. So, anything that sort of allows, those entities to conduct tests more cheaply, more expediently, without, a lot of the burdens that urine collection brings, is a good thing. Probably a better thing, for those agencies than, for Major League Baseball that can afford to conduct 20,000 urine tests. But that being said, we do view benefit to having a testing form that is less burdensome. You can do it quickly. You can do it pre-game, post-game, without the burden and all the procedures that by necessity have to be followed and sometimes go wrong when collecting and analyzing urine. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to you, Jeff. I noted that when you started your as the vice president, you said that you were going to create a gold standard testing program for your sport. So I guess you are willing and maybe also able to take in some of these new methods in your program? Or how do you see it?
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely love what I'm hearing this morning about these new methods, really for two reasons. First, obviously, the non-invasiveness and the non-intrusiveness of these collection procedures. And while I'm sure Dan and Andy would both express concerns about their athletes getting stuck in the arm, just before a ball game or 18 holes, when it comes to the UFC and my sport, the most skilled mixed martial artists in the world, every square inch of the world, major concerns about somebody, having a recently stuck arm the day of the fight or even the day before. So I think the ability, the convenience of that collection method would be huge. Personally, in my experience, I think that's the biggest weakness or loophole in anti-doping and testing, and that's predictability. you know, on a major scale, you know, lack of out-of-competition testing. But I've even seen it in my previous law enforcement career with professional cyclists of athletes adapting to predictability within a matter of hours. So the professional cyclists knew they weren't going to be tested during the Tour de France for 8 hours a night to let them sleep, and were able to exploit that window of that 8 hours to figure out what fast-clearing, fast-acting drugs they could use to get benefits the next morning will they be clear from the system. So while I believe the UFC, in terms of predictability, has the strongest program in professional sports, there is an area of predictability in that likely an athlete will not be will not be blood tested the day of the fight, just because of the intrusiveness of that procedure. So, you know, the new blood spotting thing I think would be huge for our sport. The second area I think that's important, and it was a word that Daniel Eichner brought up earlier today, is perception. And in my experience, the perception of any anti-doping program from an athlete's perspective is just as important of the reality of that program. And the more, in my opinion and experience, the more bells and whistles and technology that anti-doping has, the perception of that strength of the program goes up.
Okay, thank you very much. Andy, Jeff touched a little bit upon it, and I also noted that you have been out saying previously that you were a little bit skeptical to blood testing when it comes to golfers, and even raising the question about getting anemia or things like that. But with the new methods being developed, like dried blood spots, it should be no problem then, or what do you think?
Well, certainly, you know, we are concerned about, you know, how a needle in the arm would affect a player's ability to compete, and that was something that, you know, we were very concerned about going into our first Olympic Games, which was this year. We subsequently had the vast majority of the Olympians were subject to blood testing and didn't experience any issues, so that was very positive for our sport to see that happen. And we learned a great deal from that experience. I definitely see a lot of great potential in some of these methods that have been discussed today. It's our responsibility as program administrators to employ the very best testing methods possible. We have a responsibility to protect the integrity of our competition for our sport and for the athletes themselves. But we also have a fiscal responsibility to do that as efficiently as possible. And to the extent that these methods can help us be more efficient, whether it's from a cost perspective or from a time perspective, or any other areas, I mean, that would certainly be helpful. At this point, you know, blood and urine are the most well-respected and efficient methods of testing. And so in the very immediate future, I don't necessarily see us taking on these new testing methods until we can prove that they can cover a broad variety of substances that we're looking for example, or that it can decrease the amount of time it takes to get results returned back to us. Reduce the cost, and then of course the very obvious benefits of not being as intrusive to an athlete whose arms and hands are very critical to their performance. So we are definitely monitoring these, but I don't think we're quite ready yet.
Okay. Thank you very much, all three of you, for the initial answers. It seems to me that you're all positive in general to these new methods, but you're also a little bit kind of not reluctant, but want to wait until science has proved further the benefits of these methods. Could you see any of your organizations being part of maybe a pilot project or something in cooperation with some of the scientists? Dan?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, you know, the real issue is, you know, how much confidence the scientists, you know, have in these methods. I mean, if you ask an athlete, if you ask our Players Association, I mean, sure, if an athlete had his choice between a less intrusive method and an intrusive method, he's going to, you know, choose the more efficient way to be collected. Interestingly, anecdotally, a lot of our players now prefer blood testing than urine testing because they're in and out, really quickly, rather than after you get off the field and you're dehydrated, sitting after the game, which our games end, a little too late now for our commissioner, but trying to work on that, but, sitting there to give a sample. So, the issue is really, I think, a science issue. There's people in this room that have kind of devoted their life to drug testing and, the anti-doping cause, and, they'll remember that, it wasn't that long ago when, testosterone positives and IRMS, were challenged, significant challenge, in Hamilton case and, other cases, and that, that's with urine testing. So, I just think it's going to take a while before, the lab directors, who are key in this, have sufficient confidence and experience, with these methods across the range of substances. And there's a lot of substances to introduce them, widely. That being said, I think with the athletes, consent, and it would have to be done carefully. If it was kind of a non-punitive, pilot program to get data, I think we can probably, try to arrange something like that. But that's what it would take. But I do think there's a lot of promise, but I also think, we're talking sort of the next generation of testing, and and I think we're years out. But that being said, you got to start now if you want to implement better methods. Even 5, 7, 10, years from now. That's how long it probably takes.
Yeah, I would say that if we were to do something like that, we wouldn't do it at the very, very elite level like the PGA Tour. We operate 6 tours, and if we were to test something, it would probably be at one of those lesser tours. I shouldn't say lesser, but lower tiers. But again, before we, as Dan said, before we would do anything like that, there would have to be significant support in the scientific community from the method of testing, and it would have to be pretty solid against any legal challenges that might come along from a positive result. And if we got to that comfort level, then yeah, we would probably start at those lower tiers with some experimental testing, and then graduate on up to the elite level.
Why would you make a program like that only in the lower tier? What would be the reason for that?
Well, this is, to be frank, our athletes compete for considerable sums of money each week. Mm-hmm. And if we were to have a testing method that, say, hadn't been challenged in court before, and we had an issue, the level of exposure is much, much more significant at the highest level. So yeah, that's probably why we would do that.
So you want to protect your sport a little bit?
Well, protect the sport, protect the organization, and but also, we want to assist in the advancement of anti-doping. So if we can test it, we will.
Okay, Jeff.
Yeah, I would mirror Andy in that. In terms of positive tests that result from these new collection method, we want to make sure that the science was sound. But on the other side, we talked to her little talk this morning that maybe these collection methods at the time are imperfect in terms of trying to catch dopers. I think in that way we would err on the side of going with these collection methods earlier. Again, going back to the perception word that I used early. Even if imperfect in detecting these drugs, I think the perception of using this technology for our athletes would be positive in terms of trust, confidence in the program, and deterrence. I can probably give no better real-world example than what the UFC goes through in comparisons of collections, in that when we go and put on an event, whether it be here in the United States or throughout the world, we are governed or regulated by, well, the U.S. state athletic commissions and other countries' national MMA federations. And oftentimes, especially here in the U.S., even though we bring our athletes into that event being, tested year-round, a lot of these commissions prefer, because they're the regulators, to conduct their own testing. And so we will often have events where one of our athletes being tested maybe pre-bout by the commission and post-bout by USADA, who's the independent administrator of our program. And the differences between those collection methods, so the commission usually will go more of an employment testing collection method where not the Berlinger kits that USADA uses, but just a cup where literally the collector will hand it to the athlete to go provide the sample in the toilet stall, bring it back out. The collector's then handling the sample. Compare that with the USADA collection procedure, where they're presented with multiple kits to choose from, where only the athlete handles their samples. Time and time again, I've had athletes come up to me and talk about the lack of strength of the commission drug testing program versus USADA, even though in most cases, Nevada and California being perfect examples, those samples are sent to Daniel's lab at Smyrtle. They probably do the same level of special analysis on those samples. So the testing is just as good as ours, but this perception that the collection is not as good as as the UFC's and USADA's, that perception basically affects trust in the program, confidence in the program, and when those start going away, in my experience, that's when athletes start looking at loopholes and weaknesses and ways to get around it. So I think the perception of that collection is huge, and I think these methods, because they are so state-of-the-art, would go a long way in fostering that trust and confidence and compliance with the programs.
Would the implementation of any of these methods mean that you would have to change your policies or even your anti-doping regulations? Andy?
Well, we have a governance process that we would have to go through. We're a membership organization, so all of our athletes are members and they have elected representatives on our board of directors. So there's 4 athlete directors and 5 independent directors. That any significant change to our rules and regulations, whether it be a policy regarding membership or an anti-doping policy, would all have to go through our governance process and be reviewed by that group.
Dan?
We would have to reach an agreement with the Major League Baseball Players Association on any change to our drug testing program for major league players. For minor league players, we could do it unilaterally, but again, when it comes to drug testing, we're very careful, and we would prefer that our major league program and our minor league program be as close as possible, and today they are extremely similar in terms of policies. I mean, there's very few material differences, between both policies. But for the major league players, we would have to bargain over any change to the collection procedures. But like I said, our Players Association and our players, I think generally would be open to anything that reduces the burden on drug testing. But on the other side, I mean, we would have to show them with a lot of evidence, just like any anti-doping agency, would have to convince athletes that the new collection methods are validated and produce, accurate results. I mean, the other thing I should add is that, at least I could speak for the North American laboratories, but, I'm generally true among all WADA laboratories. I mean, Dr. Io, Dr. Eichner, I don't know if Dr. Butch is here today. I mean, they're experts right now. I mean, they're wizards with urine. I mean, for those of you who, for those of you who are kind of involved in sort of the business, I mean, the level of sophistication now, is, kind of off the charts. I mean, even compared to 5 years ago, 7 years ago, I mean, they're just very, very good at what they do because they see so many urine samples and they're analyzing so many samples that they can tell a lot, from a urine sample. I would have to kind of, rely on them to tell us how much they can tell, from these new collection methods. But for example, and I don't know because it's really a scientific question, but, I think most anti-doping agencies today have some type of longitudinal program where they're collecting data, for an athlete over time. Whether you can do that with, these alternative methods that we're hearing about and what type of information is derived from it, I don't know. But that's an important part of a doping program. It's just these days, it's just not, let's kind of test the sample and report the results. Particularly in difficult cases, there's sort of a lot of sort of experience, judgment, and analysis that the WADA lab directors perform. I mean, they're the best in the world, and there's not that many of them at what they do. So, I would want to be confident that they can do that same level of analysis, create longitudinal data with whatever new methods are developed. So it's just a very complicated area, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to be guided by the scientific community and research.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, it is a complicated subject, and that's exactly why we have this session. I would like to open up to questions from the floor. We have some 15 minutes back. There must be tons of questions waiting. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, this applies to baseball, but maybe beyond that. So it sounds like there's validation that's required before you can implement a new test because in part to be resistance from the Players Association. But is that really a major barrier, or would there be resistance, for example, to more testing, which is one of the benefits of this kind of a protocol? I mean, more easier. Is that really the barrier?
Yeah, I mean, our union's here, but and they can speak for themselves. But I'll just, given that I have the microphone, I will speak for them. At least on one topic. I mean, our players. Again, it's. I don't want to minimize, the sort of the burden that drug testing, imposes on an athlete. I mean, it's a burden that obviously they have to bear because they're professional athletes. But we do a lot of testing, and we kind of heard a little bit about the burden of blood testing, sticking a needle in your arm right before a game. But after biogenesis, I mean, I'll go into what that is, but we had a big investigation where a lot of players were disciplined. We negotiated with the players over changes to our program, and their first proposal, not our first proposal, their first proposal was to double the number of tests that we were doing, which we're already doing a lot of tests. And then in the last round of bargaining, we added, again, based on their proposal, thousands of more tests. So, our players in recent years have shown, great willingness to be tested. Just to give you an example, even off-season testing, which is, more of a burden. In the last round of bargaining, we agreed that every player at a minimum will be tested, randomly once during the off season, with the potential to be tested more than once. And we went from something, I can't remember the exact number, something like 350 off-season tests to about 1,500 off-season tests. So, I honestly don't think, our players are opposed to more testing. Actually, they want more testing because these days we've had a culture change. They want us to catch the players who are doping. I do think, the area they would be focused on, is accuracy of these tests, whether they work, false positives, the things that, athletes and athletes representatives, frankly should be focused on. If I was them, that's what I would be focused on. So, and, by the same token, when I speak for players, We're focused on the same thing too. I mean, it's not as if we want to go out and falsely accuse a player of doping. And if you ask any lab director in the room, I mean, certainly they want a very high degree of confidence in any test that we implement. So so I guess it's a long way of saying that if the science is there, and the community, including athletes, agrees on the science, I don't think we would have a hard time. And I'll give you an example. I mean, we actually agreed in the last round of bargaining, to move to the biomarker test, with respect to HGH. And it's not like over the world there's been like vast experience in terms of positive test results with it, but based on the research that was done and the validation that was done, and based on Dr. Ayotte kind of standing up and saying that she has confidence in the test, and frankly the union and players have confidence in her, we were able to kind of get that done. So so look, I think the science is there. And the experts who have confidence in are willing to stand up and vouch for it. I don't think our players have any resistance, to the number of times they're tested and making it easier for them to be tested.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Just wondering about the possibility of actually doing athlete collecting their own samples in the future. It seems like that's potentially possible, especially with the blood spots and the potential to identify DNA and perhaps even verify collection techniques through videos or what have you. Do you think that's ever possible, or do you think there's too many legal impediments to that?
I love the theory and the idea. UFC has on our roster, I think we're about 530 athletes spread amongst 46 countries throughout the world. So a huge burden to undertake to have true year-round unannounced testing when you're talking about every square inch of the planet, literally. So the ability to do something like that, which reduces costs and burdens on USADA, who administers our program, I think would be huge for us.
Andy, you have players scattered around the world. It must be an obvious thing for you to implement.
Yeah, by nature, we're a sport where athletes actually call penalties on themselves. That's part of the rules of golf. So it's certainly something that if it was an option that I'm sure we would embrace. It would give an interesting potential for in competition, actually during the competition testing, where athletes could provide samples inside the ropes for of a competition.
I was wondering just about the effectiveness at a competition. I think we all realize that if we increase the amount of at competition testing,
sure,
which is hugely expensive, then we increase the possibility of finding things. So it could not only help the athletes, but also the effectiveness. But obviously,
it's interesting.
Thank you very much. Interesting perspectives, definitely. There must be other questions from the audience, from the room. Still have 10 minutes left. No? Yeah.
I have another odd question. We're talking about alternative matrices.
Please turn off the mic. Sorry.
Sorry. We're talking about alternative matrices and ways of doing testing and so forth, particularly regarding growth hormone. Why haven't we started to consider biometrics, measuring skull size, biologically profiling, things along those lines? It occurs to me, especially looking around the room, none of you look like you have growth hormone head, but you can literally see it. And is there a legitimate possibility to being able to detect doping through that? We've spent probably $20 million in this room on building growth hormone tests. But something like that, it seems possible in today's day and age and potentially legitimate as well.
I don't know, Jeff, if it was a question for you.
Sounds like one for Jeff. Yeah, I don't know. I don't obviously have a science background, so couldn't answer the legitimacy of those tests. But based on my experience in the world of anti-doping these last 15 years, I'm a proponent of throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, in the anti-doping movement. Education, testing obviously is paramount. The investigative side of things is huge. I think the reality is every major anti-doping scandal over the last 15 years has had an investigative element to it. I don't think you can run a successful anti-doping program without it. The testing is important and you need it, but you need all facets in order to have a successful program, in my opinion. So, the more tools and resources, in my opinion, the better.
Yes, please.
Comment there about the self-testing. There's one data point that's outside your world, but it's a very valid one. In my world of working for the pharmaceutical industry and having them get drugs accepted by the FDA has the same concerns you do that you've expressed. Validation, lots of prior examples. But there's one real success story from Merck Research Laboratories. It's a migraine drug. I do not remember what the drug is, but that if someone gets a migraine headache at midnight or 3 in the morning, or it's not easy to go to the clinic and get a blood draw. And so Merck got this drug approved entirely based upon dried blood spot analysis, collecting the sample and sending it in, to the point that I think you would have to worry or deal with is the honesty and integrity of, I can imagine there's lots of creative ways of messing up such a self-test, but if you have a migraine headache and you want to get a new drug out, you play by the rules basically. But the FDA was slam dunk, accepted that. So there's one data point, and there's several others in the work, new drug developments to be approved by the FDA, and so this will happen. And I might add, I didn't say the results that I have showed today and that we published before. We have validated the method as a bioanalytical method. That's probably not validating to the extent you're talking about, validating in the real world. But these methods are absolutely validatable by regulated bioanalysis criteria, really rigorous criteria. They're not one-stop wonders, if you will, of doing this. But you're certainly right. There needs to be a lot more examples, wider coverage of drugs, and many other issues to deal with. But I encourage you to, I hate to see such resistance to change for good reason, but it means that there could be a better way. And probably there was a time when there was resistance to urine testing as well as blood testing. And to the point I made, you don't have to ask a horse to take the blood sample. The owner can cause a problem, but these methods have potential. There just needs to be a lot more work, and I'm glad to hear your comments about the key to success is supporting us through research. So,
thank you very much. Gentleman down there, yes?
Just want to ask a different question. With the advancement of the technology and innovation, you mentioned something earlier as far as education for your athletes. Is that actually changing, like the education for these athletes as far as how the technology is getting way advanced? Is it changing the perception like testing is not a bad thing, testing is a good thing? Is that something that's slowly or quickly, or how's that affecting your athletes?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's a major push that we've done in the UFC, the education element, and it's one of the beauties of, in our case, we have USADA independently administering our program, so they make all decisions in terms of who's tested, when they're tested, all the adjudication, and what it frees me up to do internally is kind of take on that role as an advocate to the athletes and an educator. Our sport's probably a little bit different. Well, it is a lot different than Andy's and Dan's up here, in that, look, I think my career shows I'm a huge believer in the integrity of sports, but when it comes to the UFC and our sport and performance-enhancing drugs, it's at a whole new level. Again, you're talking about the most skilled mixed martial artists in the world, and when you talk about artificial enhancement in our sport, it could be very dangerous and possibly even deadly. So I think the receptiveness from our athletes is, to new technology, to new tests, is maybe a little bit higher than a golfer or a baseball player, just because of what's at stake here with our sport.
Yeah, I believe education is definitely a deterrent. We're always looking at better ways to educate not only our members, but really anybody. There's so many different ways to qualify for an elite golf event that sometimes people who have not been educated but won a qualifying event a few days prior can access into an elite event. And so to the extent where we can provide as much information as possible and in as many formats as possible, it's really, really effective. So, I mean, we're working on a big project right now that will enhance our education program, and you know, we fully expect to see it well received by all the players and be an effective deterrent as well.
Okay, thank you very much. We're almost running out of time. Is there a short final question? Otherwise, I think I will take the liberty to first of all conclude that you are all generally positive towards these new developments, but there's also, my feeling is also that you agree on there's still a way to go to see if the scientific results are so overwhelming that you will actually be willing to more actively being a part of these new testing methods. But I would like to thank all of you for participating, and I'm turning to Michael now.